Here are all the various changes I noticed between the original United Kingdom version and the United States version of Rainbow Magic number 10, Pearl the Cloud Fairy. Only one of the changes affects the plot. The UK version says Rachel and Kirsty can use their lockets to turn themselves into fairies and back. The US version changes it so they can't turn themselves back into humans. That's not a big change, but it does explain why the girls don't turn themselves into fairies and fly around whenever they want, like they do in the movie. In this book, the girls turn from fairies to humans twice. Both times, Pearl is the one who turns them into humans. So it doesn't really matter if they can turn themselves from fairies to humans or not. If they do have that power, they never use it. Still, I say that's the biggest change made to the book. You can decide for yourself if one of the other changes is more important. Let's start with the changes made to the area before the book starts. On the map, Sweet Factory becomes Candy Factory. The High Street becomes High Street. In the poem, Doodle becomes the Rooster. The title of Chapter 2, Magic Afoot, becomes Magic in the Air. The title of Chapter 4, Candy Floss Clouds, becomes Cotton Candy Clouds. Chapter 1, the duvet becomes her bedspread. An ordinary day becomes a normal day. The sentence starting with it seems is split into two sentences after the word day. She sighed becomes she sighed with. Rachel and Kirsty were good friends who becomes Rachel and Kirsty. Best friends with the fairies becomes friends with the fairies. Scattering them far and wide becomes and banish them to Rainspell Island. Rachel and Kirsty had helped becomes Rachel and Kirsty helped. Up to mischief becomes up to no good. Once more becomes once again. Called on becomes asked. Cockerel Weathervane becomes Weathervane Rooster. A bit becomes a little. He's got becomes he has. All his feathers becomes all of his feathers. The sentence Doodle the Rooster had a very important job is added before the sentence starting with his 7 magic. But Jack Frost becomes but then Jack Frost. Goblin Thieves becomes goblins. He found himself transformed becomes he changed. Had found him becomes had found the Weathervane. Brought him becomes brought it. Never realizing becomes he had no idea. Meanwhile becomes now. In a terrible muddle becomes a big mess. It would remain so becomes it would be a mess. Could give Doodle all his feathers back and send him home becomes got all of Doodle's feathers back and sent him home. We've made becomes we're off to. The 7 weather fairies becomes the weather fairies. Whenever they were needed becomes find the feathers. Mum becomes mom all 7 times it appears in this book. Clattered downstairs becomes ran downstairs. The cockerel had briefly come alive becomes the rooster had come to life. To get out becomes to say. Becoming metal becomes turning to metal. We'll find out becomes he'll tell us. And Doodle speaks to us today is removed. Laying the table becomes setting the table. Can be becomes could be. Quite early becomes pretty early. Nearest becomes closest. Outside stood becomes there were. The word elderly is removed. Disturbed you becomes bother you. I'm afraid is removed. I haven't becomes I haven't seen her. Recently becomes lately. Perhaps becomes maybe. Just for a moment becomes for a minute. Maybe she was becomes maybe she was just. Chapter 2. Made cups of tea becomes poured cups of coffee. Worrying becomes strange. She doesn't usually becomes usually she doesn't. Finishing off her cereal becomes finishing her cereal. Right away becomes now. Difficult becomes hard. About the twitchings becomes about the twitchings today. Puzzled becomes confused. Kirsty explained becomes Kirsty told her. They were very faint is removed. Curiously is removed. In which case, we'd better keep our eyes open for magic as well as Fidget becomes, while we're looking for Fidget, we'd better keep our eyes open for magic too. Keeping a sharp lookout becomes keeping their eyes peeled. Anxiously is removed. Staring around her becomes looking around. Looking becomes watching. One of the villagers becomes someone. Gasped Rachel becomes Rachel gasped. Was looking puzzled becomes looked confused. Bad-tempered indeed becomes grouchy. Jolly becomes happy. Downcast becomes grumpy and sad. Something funny going on becomes something strange happening. Miserable becomes terrible. Children becomes kids. Enjoying their games becomes having fun. Sad and sulky becomes sad. Ice cream van arrived becomes ice cream truck stopped close by. All round becomes all over. Carry on searching later becomes keep searching later this afternoon. Cinema becomes a movie theater. Flooding out becomes pouring out. Glum becomes grouchy. Film becomes movie. Cinema becomes movie theater. Rachel pointed out becomes she continued. Trudging becomes walking. Cinema becomes theater. Cinema goers becomes peoples. Just as becomes just like. Noticed it becomes noticed. Above becomes over. Peered becomes squinted. Frowning in concentration becomes who were all frowning. For a moment becomes for a minute. Cinema goers becomes people. The sentences, I'll bet those aren't wisps of smoke at all, they're magic clouds, are added to Rachel's dialogue. It could be becomes maybe. Beyond the trail of becomes be close to finding. Hurried becomes rushed. Kirsty's mom, who was, becomes Kirsty's mom, period. She was. Sofa becomes couch. Touched with pink becomes tinted with pink. A sunset cloud becomes a cloud and sunset. Which was is removed. Silvery is removed. You were never coming becomes you would never come. Swinging her legs becomes swinging her legs below her. Sat becomes was. We're only a third of the way through, believe it or not. Chapter 3! She too becomes she also. Looked fed up becomes looked gloomy. Floaty is removed. From which is removed. Constantly is removed. Swirled becomes swirled out of it. You've got becomes you have. Kirsty burst out becomes Kirsty said. Nearby becomes close. Firmly is removed from Pearl said firmly. Which means that becomes so that. Horrible becomes mean. Restlessly is removed from Pearl fluttered restlessly. Wisps of smoke becomes clouds. Beginning becomes starting. Above becomes over. Shall we go becomes should we go. Go and find becomes go find. Went out becomes headed out. Like sunset clouds is removed. Irritable becomes annoyed. Hair standing on end becomes hair standing straight up. He's had becomes he got. You're our friends becomes you're helping us. There becomes the clouds are. Who had just passed by becomes who passed by. Above becomes over. Sweet becomes candy. Here and everywhere else it appears. Puffing their way out becomes puffing out. Chapter 4. Large becomes big. We've got becomes we have. And back is removed from turn themselves into fairies and back. Clapping her hands in delight becomes clapping her hands happily. A little becomes some. Fairy wings grew and unfurled on their backs becomes fairy wings grew from their backs. Whizzing about becomes zooming back and forth. Slipped through first becomes slipped through the vent first. Just inside becomes inside. Breathed becomes gasped. All sorts becomes all kinds. Stripy humbugs becomes peppermints. Piped out of becomes came out of. Bright yellow sherbet becomes soft ice cream. Paper tubes becomes paper cups. Toffees becomes caramel candies. And boiled sweets is removed. Because of this change, and is moved to after the word lollipops. Every kind of becomes every. Different sweets becomes different kinds of candy. Puzzled becomes confused. But surely becomes but. Gone home leaving all the machines on becomes left all the machines on. Would they? I expect becomes I bet. Spot him becomes find him. Fluttered becomes flew. Hard at work is removed. Candy floss becomes cotton candy here and everywhere else that it's mentioned. Hovered over becomes looked at. For a moment becomes for a minute. When becomes but then. Their lips becomes his lips. Beside the candy floss machine is removed. From the silver tub is removed. Big and round becomes chubby. Nearer becomes closer. Peeped becomes peaked. Spy becomes spot. Pearly gray and shimmering in his hand is removed. Waved it about becomes waved it in the air. I must becomes I have to. Pearl and Kirsty becomes Kirsty and Pearl. Fly off becomes fly away. As she did so becomes as she did. Roar becomes yelp. Grabbed Rachel tightly becomes grabbed Rachel with one hand. Having becomes getting. Which were drifting past becomes that was passing by. Up and away becomes farther and farther away. Heard her friend's voice becomes heard her friend's voice right away. Floating past becomes it was floating past. It was becomes the cloud was. Straight towards becomes straight toward. Chapter 5. I don't know becomes I don't know anymore. That goblin becomes the awful goblin did it. She went on crossly becomes she said. I've got becomes I have. You get the feather becomes you get the feather back. She zapped becomes she turned. Back up becomes back. Stormed angrily becomes stormed. To make them bigger becomes to make them even bigger than before. Rachel might be in danger becomes Rachel was in danger. Towards becomes toward. Into his mouth becomes right into his mouth. Out of sight is removed. She spotted becomes just then she spotted. Candy floss stick becomes peppermint stick. On the soles of becomes the bottom of. His becomes the goblin's. Leathery feet becomes leathery foot. Chuckle becomes laugh. Any longer becomes any more. Guffawed becomes laughed. Made a grab for becomes tried to grab. It becomes the feather. Towards becomes toward. Towing becomes pulling. And she took becomes she took. Another bite becomes another big bite of the cloud. She went on becomes she said. Frowned in a huge effort of concentration becomes began to concentrate. He began waving becomes he waved. Around becomes around in the air. Twiddled becomes twirled. Whirl becomes spin. Boasted becomes bragged. Sailed becomes flew. Whiz becomes whirl. Along with becomes with. Nearer and nearer becomes closer and closer. Stuck her arm out of the hole becomes stuck her arm out. Seized becomes grabbed. Chapter 6. Recapture becomes grab back. But missed becomes but he missed over and over again. Whizzing round becomes spinning around. Feeling very dizzy becomes getting very dizzy. Deftly is removed. Waved it expertly becomes waved it in a special pattern. Caught hold of Rachel's cloud becomes caught Rachel's cloud with one hand. And pulled becomes and she pulled. Tumbled out dizzily becomes dizzily tumbled out. Whirling round becomes spinning around. Staggering around becomes walking. Lurched forward becomes lunged forward. Made a clumsy grab becomes grabbed. The little fairy becomes her. Darted becomes flew. Tumbled over becomes tripped. Toffee becomes candy here and on the next page. Was shunted becomes moved. Boxed and gift wrapped becomes wrapped. Grinned Pearl becomes said Pearl smiling. And I'd better becomes I'd better. Everyone becomes everyone else. In an intricate pattern through the air becomes through the air in a complicated pattern. Declared becomes said. Set off back to becomes set off for. With Pearl hiding becomes and Pearl hid. No one has a cloud over their heads becomes there aren't any clouds over people's heads. Children becomes kids. Cheery becomes cheerful. Pleased becomes happy. And watched happily becomes they watched. Replaced becomes placed. A moment later becomes a minute later. The cockerel's fiery feathers becomes the rooster's feathers. Listen hard becomes listen up. Magnificent feathers becomes feathers. Moment becomes minute. I must becomes I have to. And becomes and thank you. Luck in finding becomes luck finding. Here you are at last becomes there you are. Phoned becomes called. Tea becomes coffee. They've got becomes they have. A big smile on his face becomes with a big smile. Eyes were still closed becomes eyes weren't even open yet. Gorgeous becomes beautiful. Breathed becomes whispered. The word gently is moved ahead 6 words. This is about 284 changes for a 71-page book, making about 4 changes per page.